people who have this idea that old Hollywood movies were all sweetness and light.
He loved grand.
Happy endings and innocence.
Romeo. Romeo. Me, me.
That was true for a time when the production code was enforced in 1934, but in the period just before what they call the pre-code era, films were incredibly raw and racy.
What is this? Oh, I'm getting dizzy.
Después de más de 70 años, ¿apenas han perdido el poder de escandalizar?
Do it again, I like it.
Y estimular. Las películas precódigo que se hacían antes de la aplicación del código de producción en Hollywood se han mantenido como las películas de más vitalidad que se hayan producido jamás.
Films became more adult for a brief period of time in the early 1930s.
What you feel for me is not love. The call of the gorilla to its mate.
They say and do things and you go,
Son of a...
Sexuality, violence, drug abuse.
Hollywood was pushing the envelope.
Pero pocos saben la historia de por qué esas películas eran más libres en cuanto a sexo y crítica social que las que se hicieron varias décadas más tarde. La respuesta es una mezcla fascinante de escándalo, religión y política, que había dado lugar a una de las épocas más dinámicas de la historia de Hollywood.
In a big way, sister.
1930. La América de la era del jazz se recuperaba de una terrible resaca económica después del crack de la bolsa en 1929. 5 millones de personas se quedaron sin trabajo. Las colas de hambrientos abarrotaban las calles de los 48 estados. El país entero estaba hundido en la desesperación y el cinismo.
If you're talking about the late 20s and early 30s, and you're really talking about the Depression, it was a terrible time in our country's history.
The country can't go on this way. It's the end of America. Maybe the end of us, but it's not the end of America.
En Hollywood, la industria cinematográfica luchaba para superar una época caótica. Los estudios y los empresarios habían gastado millones en pasar del cine mudo a la maravillosa tecnología de las películas habladas. La franqueza llena de slang de las películas dio lugar a violentas protestas de críticos convencidos de que el sexo y la vulgaridad iba cada vez a más en la pantalla.
There was a whole new challenge for those who wanted to censor Hollywood or control its message, because now films could talk and they could say things that might offend people or might challenge people, as well as show things in that way.
Hey, remember, boys, from now on, refrain from using any words ending in itch and R.
Now you had people saying words that sometimes could be, did you hear that? That was a swear word.
You don't think I'd drink with you, you son.
Why not?
The cartoons from the 30s were just as wild as the live-action features of those days. There's a scene in Bosco's picture show where he's confronting a villain who's captured his girlfriend, and he shouts out something.
Dirty fuck!
Now, when I first saw this film, I reran it, and every single time we watched this thing, it sounded the same way. He's saying that word.
Dirty fuck!
Now, I'll leave it for you to decide.
No era una novedad que se presentaran quejas contra las películas. En 1922 hubo un par de escándalos: el brutal juicio del cómico Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle y el asesinato sin resolver del director William Desmond Taylor colaboraron a que se calificara la imagen de Hollywood como un semillero de vicio.
The 1920s, the jazz age, was the first sexual revolution of the 20th century. And there was a radical change in sexual behavior, especially by women, that became crystallized in the wars over content in Hollywood films. The smaller communities in rural areas across America felt Hollywood movies as an alien intrusion, dissolving, deconstructing traditional values and moral codes.
One thinks of the 1920s as a very permissive time, but of course Prohibition existed, and we have always been a very Puritan people, so that conflict is always there. There was also a real fear that the government might step in.
In 1922, it was 30 years before the Supreme Court had ordered that movies were protected speech, protected under the First Amendment.
Con el fin de zafarse de la censura del gobierno, los estudios crearon un nuevo organismo para autorregular las prácticas de Hollywood. Se llamó Motion Pictures Producers and Distributors of America. Eligieron como director a un hombre de una moral intachable, el exdirector general de Correos, Will Hays.
No story ever written for the screen is as dramatic as the story of the screen itself.
Will Hays was a member of Warren G. Harding's cabinet. He was perfect for what the film industry wanted. He was a Presbyterian elder. He didn't smoke. He didn't drink. He just fit the bill for what the film industry wanted to put forward to reassure America.
The future of the motion picture is as far-flung as all the tomorrow.
He was brought to Hollywood at a movie star salary, supposedly, and told to head the MPPBA, clean up Hollywood's problems, and sell Clean Hollywood back to the American public, and also use your lobbying skills to make sure that anti-Hollywood legislation, particularly government control and censorship boards, are kept to an absolute minimum.
Service is the supreme commitment of life.
He was going to kind of be the watchdog of the industry and be the front man so that he could literally stop things before they got out of hand. Now, this would apply to motion picture content as well.
Will Hays did not have a moralistic agenda. Will Hays was interested in Hollywood running smoothly, basically.
Pero Hays se encontraba en Nueva York, lejos de Hollywood. Y a medida que avanzaban los años 20, los cineastas se negaron a rectificar su estilo pecaminoso y empezaron a hacer películas cargadas de pasión pagana.
In silent films, we do occasionally see undraped and nude or semi-nude women in scenes, sometimes almost casually.
There was this tremendous freedom, for good or ill, that almost anything went. Well, the Hays obviously didn't really do anything.
En 1927, Hays fue puesto al mando de un nuevo comité de censores nombrados por Hollywood, conocido como el Comité de Relaciones de los Estudios. Pero algunas películas, como el musical Mazan Satán, de Cecil B. DeMille, demostraron el poco caso que hacían los cineastas a la persecución del pecado.
Madam Satan is downright pornographic, you know, I mean, when Cecil B. DeMille would stage an orgy, it's like, ooh, let's go see the orgy. I mean, it's nuts. It is so insane, and they have that bizarre costume party on a Zeppelin.
Pero en 1930 llegó el momento de arreglar cuentas. Hollywood se enfrentaba a nuevas amenazas de intervención gubernamental y los ejecutivos, como el jefe de producción de la Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Irving Thalberg, lucharon por encontrar una solución, la cual llegó en forma de nuevas directrices en la censura. El código para controlar la realización de películas mudas y habladas de forma sincronizada fue propuesto y redactado en su mayor parte por dos críticos cinematográficos, Martin Quigley, editor católico del Motion Picture Herald, y el padre Daniel Lord, sacerdote jesuita y consultor en Hollywood.
The code said that you could show certain situations, you know, sexual things, adultery, this and that, but they could only be shown to the extent that they motivated the plot, and they could never be shown as being honorable, acceptable, moral. And furthermore, they couldn't be shown in such detail that they would then make the audience get excited. That's what they were really afraid of, getting those poor people down in those seats, you know, twitching and squirming and blushing.
Todos los grandes estudios se comprometieron a cumplir con el código que Will Hays y el Comité de Relaciones iban a imponer. Pero acabaría siendo una promesa en vano, pues en el Hollywood de la posdepresión, el camino a la salvación de los ingresos por taquilla se recorrería no a base de relatos para levantar la moral, sino a base de regodearse en el pecado. El 19 de abril de 1930, la Metro estrenó una película para poner a prueba el nuevo código de producción, una película que escandalizaría a los conservadores. La divorciada, protagonizada por Norma Shearer, esposa del productor de la película, Irving Thalberg. Shearer interpretó a una mujer que paga a su infiel marido con la misma moneda, acostándose con su mejor amigo.
When you say that being unfaithful doesn't mean anything, you mean just that, don't you?
What were you saying when the telephone rang?
That I've balanced our accounts.
What's fascinating is that here you have a man, Irving Thalberg, who was one of the co-authors of the code. And yet, the ink's not even dry yet, and he's trying to already get a film pushed through that violates the code.
Who's the man?
Oh, Ted, don't be conventional.
Who's the man? I want to see him.
Isn't it a rather good time to remember what you said? That it doesn't mean a thing?
Shut up, you!
Al negarse a condenar a su heroína, la divorciada desafiaba abiertamente a la nueva política del Código Hays sobre el adulterio.
The looser they are, the more they get. The best in the world, no responsibility. Well, my dear, I'm going to find out how they do it. So look for me in the future where the primroses grow, and pack your man's pride with the rest. And from now on, you're the only man in the world that my door is closed to.
MGM's justification for the divorcee was he was going to treat the subject of divorce in a very serious way.
Love, honor, and obey, huh? Don't make me laugh.
She's going to live the life of a man with lots of affairs and lots of the good life, but she's not going to like it. And in the end, of course, unlike the Ursula Parrott novel on which it was based, she returns to her husband.
New Year in a minute, Ted. All the world gets a new chance.
You look at a film like The Divorcee and you say, okay, well, this is 1930, so we've come a long way from there. But is there really still a double standard? Is there truly a single standard? I think you can read a lot of the present in this movie.
La divorciada obtuvo un Oscar por Norma Shearer y un extraordinario éxito de taquilla, lo cual hizo ver a Hollywood que con código o sin código el sexo seguía siendo el tema número uno en el cine.
One of the great revelations of the last 20 years has been the recovery of the pre-code career of Norma Shearer, who was thought to be a kind of goody two-shoes by my generation. It turned out that she was slut city, okay, in the pre-code era.
We don't believe in the awful necessity of marriage. You mean he doesn't? I mean what I said.
She had this marvelous ability, wonderful fluid body language, and really almost like an entirely different woman, an entirely different actress.
Love me?
Good thing you find out for yourself.
The women had a lot of sexual freedom in pre-code. They were able to express, like Norma Shearer in The Divorcee and Free Soul. If husbands can philander, why can't wives?
Men of action are better in action. They don't talk well.
En Alma Libre, Norma Shearer hizo el papel de la hija de un prominente abogado que inicia una intensa relación sexual con el gángster Clark Gable.
Now let me lay it on the line for you. She tossed all her writs overboard months ago. She came to my place and she stayed there. You get that? She's mine. She belongs to me.
Irving Thalberg dio un nuevo golpe a Hays y al Comité de Relaciones al no cortar esta escena tan provocativa.
Come on. Put him around me.
People often feel as if Will Hays governed like the Pope from the Vatican, and then he had absolute power of imprimatur, and he could, with a giant scissors, that cut the heart out of any script. But there was a lot of barter and a lot of give and take back and forth, and the studio got away with quite a bit.
Go on, Don Juan. Tell me about yourself.
Well, there have been women who wanted to park their heads on this manly bosom.
At how much an hour?
Después del éxito de la Metro, Warner Brothers se desquitó con la película Illicit, una nueva historia escabrosa de sexo fuera del matrimonio, interpretada por Barbara Stanwyck.
Well, we have 2 points settled, at least. I'm bright and snappy in the morning.
And we're both a riot in our underwear.
Stanwyck encarnaba a una mujer que se resiste a la proposición de matrimonio de su amante y que prefiere disfrutar del placer sexual antes de comprometerse a casarse.
This taking you home in the middle of the night, all the lying, pussyfooting.
Don't say you don't like the pussyfooting. I love it.
It's about a test marriage, and that was really kind of shocking. Free love is one thing in the Roaring '20s, but here we are in the Depression, and those kind of things are not really even discussed or thought of anymore as a possibility. But they got it through the code because, we'll deal with it very judiciously.
Nearly every girl I know, Mr. Ives, is either unhappily married or unhappily divorced. And I've simply come to the conclusion that marriage is disastrous to love.
The public image of women in general underwent a profound change into the mid-30s. Older women, who are now dowagers, wanted to continue the polarity of the good woman, versus the bad woman, the Madonna versus whore complex, which has been such a part of legend and myth. And the women who were lovingly documented by so many of these Hollywood films wanted to break that down.
En la película Amor en Venta, Joan Crawford y Clark Gable comparten 6 años de sin molestarse en pasar por el altar.
We've had a lot of happy times together, haven't we?
The only happiness I've ever known. This we bought at Tiffany's. The day you decided I should be called Mrs. Morland.
Well, it's a harmless way to make your position a little more pleasant.
There was a whole slew of films made in the early 30s where you have a motif of the kept woman or of the unwed mother.
I want to be like my mother.
No. You're going to grow up to be a splendid lady.
And one can see that sexual mores really were relaxed in that period.
As far as I'm concerned, Anne-Marie's father is dead.
Well, if you're not going to write him, I will.
No, you won't. You don't know who he is or where he is, and I'll never tell you. Never. I want to see that my baby gets a break.
Las películas precódigo ofrecían a las actrices los mejores papeles de sus carreras, como el drama de la Warner, 3 vidas de mujer.
It's an amazingly sharp and sometimes seamy melodrama about 3 women who meet as children in an orphanage and then pursue their lives in adulthood and then come together again later on.
Why do you avoid me? Have I done anything to offend you?
No, it isn't you. I don't know what it is. I just seem fed up with everything.
I might try beating you every morning before breakfast.
That might prove effective.
El personaje más fascinante es Anne Borac, una ama de casa aburrida que abandona a su marido, su casa y a su hijo de 4 años por una loca aventura de sexo y drogas.
3 on a Match was a film that was supposed to run about 75 or 80 minutes. But they did want to get more showings in per day. So they thought, let's make it about 60 minutes without cutting any of the sensational elements out. So it becomes a catalog of everything you're not supposed to do in a pre-code movie. It has adultery, frigidity, drug use, child abuse.
Mommy, I'm hungry.
Here's Mama's little honey bunch hungry. Here, have some of those.
I don't like those anymore. Can I have bread and milk?
Drunkenness, kidnapping, violence. It's quite a movie.
Say, you got a nerve busting into my flat like this? Get out!
Uh-oh. Go on, get in that room and shut up.
Al igual que muchas películas precódigo, la película lanzaba mensajes contradictorios. Destacaba todas las desviaciones de la heroína, pero acababa convirtiéndola en una figura trágica, una mujer que se redime sacrificándose para salvar a su hijo secuestrado.
Junior, wake up. Darling, do you hear me?
Yes, Mom.
Look, sweetheart, we're playing a game, see? You must run and hide. Hide under Mama's bed, quick.
Anne Dvorak was more effective, I think, in the films before the code was enforced, and she was afterwards, because she was like a raw nerve, a loose wire, vibrating and sparking.
Oh, please, God.
She really had that nervous energy.
Kirkwood boy, 4th floor.
The character of Anne Dvorak, I was so taken with the idea that it was about, female empowerment. No, 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 because you'll fall. Although you'll have an awfully good time.
Going to be a soldier, Jim?
No, I'm going to be a gangster.
Oh, I guess it's more profitable at that.
En el cine y en la realidad, 1931 fue el año de los gángsters. Las películas retrataban el interés general por los atracadores de bancos como John Dillinger y Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, figuras ensalzadas por algunos como héroes modernos.
It reflected a populist dissatisfaction with the establishment, a sense that the national institutions were not being managed in a way that was for the benefit of the people as a whole.
En Estados Unidos, el índice de desempleo alcanzó la cifra de 11 millones de personas y las salas de cine se quedaron vacías. Por primera vez, los estudios estaban perdiendo dinero.
During the Great Depression, the greatest crisis capitalism ever faced, were the worst years in Hollywood history. One by one, the Hollywood majors were falling into receivership and bankruptcy, and they felt particularly vulnerable at this time.
Economic considerations then began to prompt studios to push the limit.
Para atraer al público, Hollywood comenzó a producir una serie de dramas sociales inspirándose en los titulares de los periódicos que reflejaban el mal momento que se vivía en el país. Películas que criticaban a las autoridades y describían a los gángsters como antihéroes descarriados.
You got a drink in the house?
Well, not before breakfast, dear.
I didn't ask you for any lip. I asked you if you had a drink.
En 1931, el enemigo público catapultó a James Cagney al estrellato en el papel del duro contrabandista Tom Powers. Fue el último desafío de Warner Brothers a los avisos de Will Hayes y su grupo del Comité de Relaciones.
Little hole 6. Oh, this'll be enough. Stick 'em up. Stick 'em up.
These films were tremendously dramatic, exciting, very successful at the box office, but they seemed to glorify criminals. They showed these bad guys having endless amounts of women and money and success.
Now, you stay put if you know what that means. Oh, my bashful boy.
Cuando se estrenó El enemigo público en abril de 1931, Will Hayes recibió un sinfín de protestas. Las hijas de la Revolución Americana, los caballeros católicos de Columbus y otros grupos se enfurecieron con sus vívidas imágenes de violencia.
There was a fear, a real fear in some circles, that making these films about gangsters would glorify them and inspire young people to want to follow that path. Well, duh. There's nothing more tempting than forbidden fruit. Censors put moralistic titles at the beginning of some of the films to say that, these were the scourge of society and not to be looked up as heroes. It didn't work. It never has, it never will.
El enemigo público fue una de las muchas películas cortadas por las juntas de censura que seguían deseosas de intervenir y adaptar las películas a los gustos del público.
The problem was that you'd have a film going to a censor board in Kansas. If there was a scene of people drinking or being drunk, they would scissor it out of the print and maybe throw away those trims. So then you get a print that could not be run elsewhere. The print is worthless. So that was costing the film industry millions of dollars every year from the mid-20s on.
You know you're not getting anywhere being just a copper.
Después de El enemigo público, la Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer estrenó una gran película de gángsters, El monstruo de la ciudad, protagonizada por Walter Huston, Wallace Ford y Jean Harlow. Describía las batallas de las fuerzas del orden modernas, desde gángsters y Ginebra a corrupción policial.
Who tipped you? Come on. Who tipped you? Who did this? Beat it if you want to know. Your own brother. How do you like that, mister?
La película se hizo para honrar a la policía.
One step closer and I'll blow him in half. Come on in and get him, Jim.
Pero en el tiroteo final se produce una masacre de los personajes principales. Sin duda, la película resultó más una fuente de desesperación que de inspiración.
Beast of the City, along with a couple other MGM films of that period, almost encourage vigilantism. They really do encourage people to say, because law enforcement has proven to be worthless, corrupt, we should just take the law into our own hands and beat up these people that are causing us problems.
Y en Warner Brothers producirían un drama social que tendría un impacto aún mayor y abriría una nueva tendencia.
Business is pretty good, huh? Yeah, pretty good. How good?
Soy un fugitivo, con Paul Muni, narraba la historia real de un veterano de la Primera Guerra Mundial a quien arrestan por error.
Thought you'd get away, huh? I didn't do nothing.
Y es sometido a torturas físicas y psíquicas en una prisión sureña. Dirigida por Mervyn LeRoy, la película refleja una América en la que los pobres eran impotentes y en donde la justicia no siempre triunfaba.
Come on, get up. Quit your stalling. I was just wiping the sweat off my face. But you got it knocked off.
El ayudante de Will Hayes, Jason Joy, pidió a Warner Brothers que retiraran la escena en la que se maltrataban a los prisioneros por miedo a ofender a los del sur. El estudio se mantuvo firme y no retiró la escena. Un éxito comercial y de crítica. Soy un fugitivo incluso produjo un cambio social. En el estado de Georgia, donde había tenido lugar la historia real, las autoridades permitieron que se les quitaran las cadenas a los prisioneros.
Warner Brothers specifically always did more blue-collar movies. Warner Brothers was down in the streets. They're really energetic, and even the very dark ones have kind of a speed. I mean, Night Nurse, that movie's insane.
En Night Nurse, Barbara Stanwyck lucha contra un centro médico corrupto, una madre negligente y un chofer asesino, interpretado por Clark Gable, en su intento por evitar que dos pequeños herederos mueran de hambre.
Listen, you'll do what I tell you.
What are you trying to do, what he did?
No, but you're not going to call a doctor. You're a nurse, you give her the wash yourself.
I can't accept under doctor's orders.
Oh, yes, you can. And what's more, you will.
To me, it is pre-code. I mean, it's got everything in pre-code. It's got your cynical characters.
The thing to do is to land an appendicitis case. They've all got dough. Oh.
It's got your sharp, biting dialogue that just pushes the plot forward.
You want those kids to die.
Yeah?
Because you want what their father left them. That's why you keep the mother all hopped up and full of booze all the time. One of these days, you'll take her out and marry her and grab the children's trust fund. That's what you're after, but you're not going to get away with it.
Children being abused, drunkenness, man hitting woman, woman hitting man.
Operator! 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 Oh!
You have a really kind of base humanity in Night Nurse. The ending in particular is a little odd.
Al final, típico de las películas precódigo, Stanwyck salva la situación con ayuda de un encantador contrabandista que acaba con el personaje de Gable definitivamente.
You know, I just been thinking, maybe Nick won't be arrested.
Why not?
Well, I ain't seen him around since last night.
Think he's run away?
No.
Well, what do you think?
I ain't got an idea. Only I happened to be talking to a couple of guys last night.
What difference does that make?
Nothing. Only I happened to mention I didn't like Nick so good.
What happens is the gangster goes and kills the bad guy. He's murdered. He's murdered.
Some guy got taken for a ride.
Bootlegger?
No.
He was wearing a chauffeur's uniform.
It's kind of like The Godfather. It's like, well, you know, is that okay? Are we allowed to do that?
What I find really wild about it is the fact that Barbara Stanwyck, you know, backs off or drives off in the sunset with the guy who arranges to have him killed. It's insane, but it's the only kind of happy ending this movie can have.
En 1933, el Código Hays pasó de ser la regla menos respetada desde la prohibición.
Part of the problem was that Will Hays, the entire department, was on studio payroll. They were being subsidized by the movie industry to be a watchdog for the industry. How good a watchdog can it be when it's in there getting kibbles and bits from the kitchen? It just wasn't possible.
En 1933 ya estaba muy extendida una infracción del Código de Hays. La homosexualidad era teóricamente ilegal en gran parte de la década de los 30. También estaba prohibida en el código bajo el eufemístico término de perversión sexual. Pero eso no significaba que no hubiera gays y lesbianas en las pantallas.
Don't forget, plenty of room in there.
Oh, sir, here's where you need the room. Such a muscle.
The 1930 production codes specifically prohibited sex perversion or any inference thereof.
Oh, darn.
Again, it didn't happen. They didn't prevent it.
You saw in the early 30s, gay men in particular, used as a source of humor.
Oh, you're smart, Mr. Skinner. You surely smart. Oh, Mr. Skinner.
Not so so with lesbianism. Lesbianism always had a kind of a certain cachet. And you can cite a number of delicious examples.
Watch out for her. She likes to wrestle.
The sexuality of the women is very interesting when you have gay women in the movies, because it's like, yikes, you know, you're just not used to seeing it.
There's a lot of big sharks in here that just live on fresh fish like you. Yeah, when they add you up, what do you spell?
As the 30s progressed, lesbians actually were more prominently featured than gay men.
I do not wish to marry and they cannot force me.
Cuando la Metro anunció que Greta Garbo iba a interpretar a la reina Cristina, la soberana sueca del siglo XVII, cuya bisexualidad era un hecho histórico, Will Hays advirtió que no se admitiría ninguna alusión al lesbianismo.
Eva, come in.
Pero sin tener en cuenta la advertencia, la Metro y el director Ruben Mamoulian tenían otras ideas.
Queen Christina very clearly is having a more than cordial relationship with her lady-in-waiting.
But at the end of the day, you're never free to go anywhere. You're surrounded by musty old papers and musty old men, and I can't get near you.
Today I'll dispose of them by sundown, I promise you. And we'll go away for 2-3 days in the country. Oh, wouldn't you like that?
Oh, I'd love it.
El Comité de Relaciones exigió que se borrara una frase blasfema del diálogo de la escena que sigue a una noche de amor heterosexual.
This is how the Lord must have felt when he first beheld the finished world, with all his creatures breathing, living.
El diálogo de la escena cargada de erotismo permaneció intacto.
I know that there was a lot of uproar about the morning after scene. The obvious implication was that they're in the afterglow of making love. And also, I think some Protestant publication thought it was wrong of her to be caressing bed knobs. They found it disturbing and pornographic.
La reina Cristina de Suecia supuso un importante cambio en la historia de la censura. El hombre encargado de controlar la película era el recién nombrado jefe del Comité de Relaciones, un ferviente católico llamado Joseph Ignatius Breen.
Joseph Breen was a former newspaper man, public relations man for the Motion Picture Association. And he was brought in because Hays needed kind of a spy. But Hays didn't realize what he had done, which was to put a real zealot in there. He really believed that these people were sinful and they were corrupting America.
We must be on the lookout for scenes or action or dialogue which are likely to give offense. The responsible men in this industry want no such pictures and will not allow these to be shown.
Joseph Breen very much had a kind of Orthodox Catholic perspective and very much had a mission in Hollywood that he wished to advance the moral rules as well as the sexual limitations of the Catholic Church in Hollywood film.
Al principio, los directores de los estudios ignoraron a Breen, igual que habían hecho sus predecesores. Cuando Breen exigió que se hicieran cortes en la reina Cristina de Suecia, la Metro obtuvo la aprobación de la película sin hacer cambios, después de proyectarla ante un jurado de la MPPDA.
Was given to a jury of Hollywood producers, and their last word almost always was to pass the film and let it get out and be seen by the public.
What a country.
3 meses después de haber perdido la batalla de la reina Cristina de Suecia, Joseph Breen descubrió otra violación flagrante del código en el musical de la Warner, Wonderbar.
May I cut in?
Why, certainly.
Boys will be boys.
Cuando Breen llamó a Jack Warner repetidamente para protestar por la película, Warner se negó a atender sus llamadas. Eso confirmó la opinión de Breen sobre el estudio y su productor, al que él describía como vulgar, grosero, cargado de frases con doble sentido y obscenidades.
Some of what you saw was sophistication, an adult approach to story and dialogue and relationships. Some of it was racy, very obvious come-ons.
Yeah, they got pretty faces, too.
Warner Brothers did not like the production code and did not like the Studio Relations Committee, and they really did not like Joseph Breen. At one point, they referred to him as the Purity Squad.
This is no time for sex.
That's what you say.
Yeah. Well, it's sex of one and half a dozen of another.
En 1934, Joseph Breen comprendió que Hollywood era indiferente, o algo peor, a sus esfuerzos por sanear el cine. Los estudios ya no fingían que sus películas utilizaban el sexo únicamente para contar una historia moralista. Pero el cruzado se negó a dejarse intimidar ni por el mismísimo Tarzán. Breen rechazó inmediatamente la película de aventuras de la Metro de 1934, Tarzán y su compañera. A pesar de la prohibición de desnudos impuesta por el código, era evidente que lo único que había sobre el cuerpo de la doble de Maureen O'Sullivan era la cámara.
Joe Breen, looking at this, thinking, good grief. They rejected the film. But it turns out later that there were 3 versions of the underwater swimming scene, going to different territories. One where she's in the nude, one where she has on her bottoms but doesn't have on her top, and one where she has on her full little outfit.
Durante años, los cineastas estuvieron burlando la prohibición de desnudos, utilizando el poder de sugestión en películas como La diosa de Montmartre. Joel McCrea interpreta a un pintor norteamericano en París. Constance Bennett es una modelo que se convierte en su amante.
The code said specifically, nudity is not allowed, in fact or in silhouette. And yet all through the period between March 1930 right to July 1st, 34, you'll see all these different movies have these scenes of people in silhouette, and they really were nude.
It's been a while since I've seen Ruben Mamoulian's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but I still remember the incredible image of Miriam Hopkins as Ivy, the prostitute, swinging her leg back and forth on the side of the bed. It's not wildly explicit, but it's provocative.
Come back soon, won't you?
Sorry, I'm afraid I can't.
Soon.
There was a number of different versions of that scene sent to different parts of the country. In one scene, she'll hop right into bed and she's already covered. The next version she had was getting undressed a little bit longer, and the third version she was getting undressed for a long time, about a minute. So you can see that they knew that they would get away with it in some areas and not in others. But strangely enough, the New York Censor Board was one of the harshest.
Oh, don't be embarrassed. You can't show me a thing. I just came from the delivery room.
It got so bad, all this flagrant dressing and undressing, that Jason Joy wrote, not just once but several times, to Will Hays and said, what are we going to do with this? He said, they're just using these scenes to titillate the audience. This is not necessary to the story. This is not advancing the plot. It's something that they're doing so that people will talk about it and tell their friends.
A veces, la desnudez está en la imaginación del que mira, ante la tentación que sugiere un vestuario provocativo. Y nadie iba más lejos que Busby Berkeley, el genial coreógrafo de la Warner, quien convirtió el cuerpo femenino en su especialidad artística en películas como La calle 42 y Desfile de Candilejas.
Busby Berkeley got away with murder by reducing the female figure to abstract design in motion. He went right by the noses of the censors. But when you look at his work microscopically, if that isn't like salacious filmmaking at its best, I don't know.
El desprecio de Berkeley por los censores se refleja en la historia, no de uno, sino de dos musicales precódigo, incluida la de Desfile de Candilejas, de 1933.
Oh, you're going to start to tell me what I can use and what I can't use.
Hell, it's my job to see that our prologues fit in with the censor regulations. I'm only doing my duty.
Uh-huh. Well, I've got some bad news for you. You're fired. Get out of here and stay out.
Yeah, we'll see about...
Get out of here.
En el universo de Berkeley, la censura no es más que un sinónimo de hipocresía.
Well, just folks.
Why, I was just showing Miss Rich what you can't do in Kalamazoo.
Pero fuera de la pantalla, los censores como Joseph Breen eran mucho más duros y los primeros tiempos de permisividad en Hollywood estaban llegando a su fin.
You remember Aunt Lola?
Not anytime Annie. Say, who could forget her? She only said no once and then she didn't hear the question.
En 1934, las tensiones entre los realizadores y el Comité de Relaciones de Will Hays se intensificaron aún más. El colaborador más duro de Hays, Joseph Breen, estaba absolutamente furioso con las películas que promovían el vicio. Películas en las que el sexo era una mercancía que se vendía a cambio de poder o dinero.
How much?
16 colons.
16? That's more than I can pay.
Why, it's my rate, sir, for one night. For a lady and gentleman.
You had sex and prostitution, which sort of played out of the Depression.
Come on, baby. What are you afraid of?
Because you had a lot of suffering and poverty, so prostitution was a kind of way to make a go of it.
Yeah. Oh, hello, Angie.
Listen, dearie. A friend of mine called up and he's lonesome, see? His wife is out of town and he wants somebody to go places with him. Sort of show him a good time.
I'm practically there.
Desde Marcada por el crimen hasta Asesinato en la terraza, el cine se llena de películas que exploran el vínculo entre el sexo, el dinero y el poder.
He's a grand kid. Kind you can take home to dinner and no hard feelings if you don't ask her to stay to breakfast. And no hard feelings if you do, huh?
Penthouse is a wonderful film. One of the things that's interesting about it is Myrna Loy's character. She's a call girl. And they don't actually say the word, but they don't really work to hide that.
Want me to take you home?
Your home or my home?
Any way you like.
She's a very sympathetic character in the film. That wouldn't have been possible just 3 years later.
Go to bed.
I hate to quit on you, but cheer up. Maybe I talk in my sleep.
En Employees Entrance, de 1933, Loretta Young es explotada por un tiránico jefe de departamento de unos almacenes, interpretado por Warren William.
You don't have to go, you know.
Oh, yes, I do.
No, you don't.
I love Warren Williams. He's an underappreciated talent. He's handsome, he's good-looking, and he's suave. And he could play really sleazy. I mean, he was really sleazy. But at the same time, he could be really so charming.
Hello, Mr. Anderson.
Oh, it's you. I didn't know you with all your clothes on.
Warren Williams' characters would never have been the main character in a film after 35, which was this seducer, essentially, this powerful seducer, this amoral character who plays it for laughs.
Oh, my dear child. I'm old enough to be your father.
But do you feel like a father?
A lot of those movies are very Damon Runyon in terms of that despicable characters, but treated with affection because they're colorful.
Mud in your eye?
Hair off your head.
Algunos meses después del estreno de Employees Entrance, la Warner dio al mismo argumento un sorprendente giro feminista.
Suppose you come to my house to dinner tonight at 7:30. We'll talk about it then.
En el drama romántico Female, Ruth Chatterton encarna a la brillante directora de una fábrica de automóviles que es igual de buena en la sala de juntas que en la cama.
You know, a long time ago I decided to travel the same open road that men travel. So I treat men exactly the way they've always treated women.
Ruth Chatterton is portraying a sort of American Catherine the Great, a woman who could do what she wanted and not be punished for it.
The whole opening of that movie is fabulous. I love the establishment of her capability, her efficiency, her generosity. She's not a bad person at all.
Por la noche, su actitud de jefa seria da paso a un juego depredador en el que va escogiendo entre sus empleados masculinos.
You see, the psychology of these pep meetings is to work up enthusiasm.
Are you naturally enthusiastic?
In Female, when Ruth Chatterton wants to seduce a man, she throws the pillow on the floor. And how she dismisses them afterwards.
I'm a busy woman. I can't be annoyed with jealous or moody men about me.
But I love you.
That's enough of that.
Nuevamente, el equipo de Will Hayes se queda horrorizado con la película. Dicen que el personaje de Chatterton refleja un apetito sexual demasiado evidente. La Warner estrenó la película sin hacer cambios.
Where do you get all that energy?
Things really got raunchy. And if one studio would say, well, if he can do it, we're going to do it.
The ones that were deliberately exploitive were meant to be shocking even then. They were meant to raise your eyebrows. They were naughty.
Warner Brothers no fue el único estudio que demostró que las películas verdes aumentaban los ingresos de taquilla. La Paramount explotó esa mina de oro con Mae West, la cual utilizó el sexo como tema de celebración y sátira.
You better come up and see me.
Paramount cast her in films that are raucous and rowdy and raunchy and are fabulous smashes at the box office and almost single-handedly keep Paramount from going completely out of business.
You were wonderful tonight.
I'm always wonderful at night.
Yes, but tonight you were especially good.
Well, when I'm good, I'm very good. But when I'm bad, I'm better.
En la Metro, Jean Harlow alcanzó el estatus de superestrella interpretando a mujeres liberadas que no se avergonzaban de utilizar sus cuerpos para sobrevivir y prosperar.
Say, that hurts a little bit.
You don't like to be hurt, do you?
Oh, I don't know. Kind of fun sometimes if it's done in the right spirit.
MGM made her over into this wisecracking but powerful woman who got where she wanted to go by a horizontal ladder.
How many times have I told you to let down those curtains?
What's the matter? Afraid I'll shock the Duchess? Don't you suppose she's ever seen a French postcard?
I love Jean Harlow. I mean, it's one of the things that Harlow and Stanwyck had. They had wit. They had intelligence. They had snappy patter. They were not bimbos.
I don't mind taking orders, but there's one decision that's always up to me.
She was an original. There had never been an actress, a sex symbol, that you could also laugh with. You were laughing with her and you were getting turned on by her.
So gentlemen prefer blondes, do they? Yes, they do.
A la hora de la censura, ninguna película de Harlow causó tanto revuelo como La pelirroja.
Well, it'll get me more there than it will hanging on the wall.
Harlow interpretaba a una mujer ambiciosa y promiscua que destroza el matrimonio de su jefe y le lleva al altar, además de dejarle sin blanca.
When we're at the office and you send for me to take a letter, do you know what happens?
No.
Before you even begin, you look me over, all over.
Red-Headed Woman is one of the great Jean Harlow roles, and something about Harlow herself, who's just the epitome of the pre-code woman, because she's sexy, she's frank, she's smart in her own way. She's no brain, but she sets out to seduce, and that's what she does, and shamelessly.
And there we were like an uncensored movie when in waltzes Mrs. William Legendre Jr. and catches us right in the old family parlor. Oh, you're dirty little home wrecker.
Los críticos católicos en particular se indignaron al ver que, aunque el personaje de Jean Harlow hubiera pasado de las manos de un hombre a otro y hubiera acribillado a su exmarido, no recibía un castigo.
I've got the most marvelous news for you. I'm going to marry Kirsty.
Oh, sweetheart.
In the end, she actually gets away with it, and she meets another man and goes off to Paris with him, and just in the end, she's just happy as a lark.
Albert.
Madame.
À la maison.
Oui, madame.
El cine se abarrotó de gente que quería ver lo que, según un crítico, era la película más depravada que se había hecho en Hollywood.
Oh, do it again. I like it. Do it again.
Para no quedarse atrás, la Warner se precipitó a producir su propia versión de La Pelirroja, que probablemente fue la película más extravagante y lasciva de toda la era precódigo.
Yeah, you're exclusive, you are. The sweetheart of the night shift. Come on, you're wasting my time. Everybody knows about you.
Yeah? Well, you ain't going to...
Carita de Ángel, una historia de Darryl F. Zanuck, protagonizada por Barbara Stanwyck en el papel de una cínica provinciana que va a Nueva York y literalmente alcanza la cima.
Have you had any experience?
Plenty.
Babyface is just in a class by itself. It's not just raunchy, though it is.
What's your hurry?
It's not just seamy, though it is.
Come here, sweetheart.
Oh, lay off, you think, Abe.
It's almost unpleasant in its wallowing in the worst of human nature. On the male side, for sure, but eventually Stanwyck herself dives in as a defensive measure. She's going to trump the men in her life and get revenge for all the men who dumped on her, beginning with her father.
Don't let him tramp you.
Yeah, I'm a tramp, and who's to blame? My father. A swell start you gave me. Ever since I was 14, what's it been? Nothing but men, dirty, rotten men. And you're lower than any of them. I'll hate you as long as I live.
Babyface has this camera crane going up the side of a building, showing her ascending the hierarchy of the building, bettering herself by sleeping with every man on every floor.
The boss won't be back for an hour.
Well, then why don't we go in and talk this over?
It's a striking movie, one, because like many of the pre-code pictures, it's surprising how frank they are about the fact that she's sleeping her way up the corporate ladder.
Brody. This is an outrage. A man in your position. Get your check at once.
It's morally very interesting because you never dislike her. She is the heroine. And yet she's basically reprehensible.
Well, you know how much
How much you what? Are you letting me go?
Como era de esperar, Joseph Breen exigió 4 minutos de cortes y algunos cambios en Carita de Ángel, alegando que en ningún momento se denuncia la forma descarada con la que la heroína utiliza a los hombres.
So Joe Breen actually rewrites the dialogue, and there's this sort of geezer who's always quoting Nietzsche to Barbara Stanwyck, telling her that you can be the master, you can choose what you want.
Exploit yourself. Be strong. Defiant. Use men to get the things you want.
Then he inserts something about, but you must make good choices, and there's a difference between good and evil.
A woman, young, beautiful like you are, could get anything she wants in the world. But there is a right and a wrong way. Remember, the price of the wrong way is too great.
Breen intentó suavizar el contenido y los personajes sórdidos de la película, pero no logró engañar al público. Viva el pecado, escribió la revista Liberty. Si creen que no es rentable, contemplen los pecados de Barbara Stanwyck en su empeño por llegar al último piso de un gran banco de Manhattan.
That's pretty much the attitude people had by 33, 34 was that, okay, we're going to get this wild, catalog of sin.
Why, you...
And, of course, they're going to pay for it at the end. But we know that they're just doing that to keep the censors quiet.
America will weather this depression as she has weathered other depressions.
The American people have risen before, and they will rise again.
Abril 1934. Tras 16 meses de liderazgo del presidente Franklin Roosevelt, los americanos empezaban a sentir algo que ya casi habían olvidado: esperanza. La estabilidad económica volvía a ser posible gracias al nuevo acuerdo de Roosevelt.
The mood had changed. I think families in general wanted a sense of returning to the stable moral roots that they had had before World War I.
En 1934 también hubo buenas noticias en Hollywood. Los ingresos de taquilla recuperaron el nivel anterior a la depresión. Sin embargo, se percibía un cambio. La batalla con la censura había alcanzado un punto crítico.
Many audiences recoiled at some of the material, some of the so-called smart, urban, sophisticated material they were being fed. And this stuff turned them off.
And the church groups and the various states and the ladies groups and the parent groups, they were getting to a point where something was going to happen.
The Catholic Church in particular took a very aggressive line against what it felt was rampant Babylonian-era decadence coming out of Hollywood. And at that time, there was also an unsavory kind of anti-Semitism in the air. So many of early Hollywood's producers and directors and writers were Jewish. And there was a sense that this was a plot by Jews to tear down Christian values.
Convencido de que a los estudios solo les importaban los ingresos de taquilla, Joseph Breen pasó meses organizando tranquilas protestas contra Hollywood entre los 20 millones de católicos que había en el país.
Breen was working kind of both sides. He not only worked within Hollywood and within the MPPDA, he was in constant contact around the United States with Catholic authorities who were in sympathy with what he was doing.
Las protestas de los católicos alcanzaron su punto álgido en abril de 1934 con la incorporación de un nuevo grupo muy poderoso, la Legión de Decencia Católica. En un mes, más de 3 millones de personas juraron condenar totalmente esas películas lascivas que estaban corrompiendo la moral pública y generando una histeria sexual en el país.
The Legion of Decency was designed to directly challenged the American motion picture business. It took in every film that was released and evaluated it and gave it a rating. If a film got a condemned rating from the Legion of Decency, it was considered to be a sin for a Catholic person to see that film. And priests were instructed that they should sermonize against C-rated films from the pulpit on Sundays.
During Sunday Mass, they would have you take out a little pencil and sign a card and then take a pledge after the sermon that you would not go to see these movies that the Catholic Church said were condemned, under pain of mortal sin.
Well, this, of course, was a major disaster because, you know, we're talking about a vast percentage of the public, particularly at that time.
En mayo de 1934, la Legión organizó un boicot de todas las películas que se exhibían en Filadelfia. Finalmente, Hollywood izó la bandera blanca y pidió a Joseph Breen que acabara con el boicot.
So Joseph Breen, who had been waiting in the wings, hovering about, involved, but not the big man on campus, he took over in Hollywood.
Breen insistió en que se aplicara rigurosamente el Código de Producción de 1930 y que en el futuro solo se podrían hacer películas si el guión era aprobado antes de comenzar el rodaje.
Joseph Breen was able to push Will Hayes and the MPPDA into creating a new entity called the Production Code Administration, the PCA, a new office in Hollywood that would take that production code written in 1930 but apply it specifically and to the letter to every single film that was coming out of Hollywood.
If you didn't get a seal of approval from the Hayes office, you couldn't get a play date for your movie. So they used that to bludgeon everyone.
Obligada a someterse, la MPPDA nombró a Breen jefe de la nueva PCA.
You will understand that our Production Code Administration is not a one-man censorship. It represents the considered judgment of many persons of wide experience and a sincere interest in making motion pictures.
Breen también añadió un punto importante al Código de Producción. En el futuro, el mal en las películas debía ser identificado y castigado plenamente. También quedaba prohibido poner en duda lo que Breen llamaba la autoridad legalmente constituida.
Breen was conservative politically, and he didn't want any films that attacked the establishment, that challenged any aspect of the traditional American system.
From the very beginning of the picture, we worked with producers, authors, scenario writers, directors, and all who are connected with the production, to the end that the finished product may be free from reasonable objection, and that our pictures may be the vital and wholesome entertainment we all want these to be.
Pero algunos cineastas veteranos se negaron a rendirse sin pelear. Cuando la PCA exigió cambiar algunas escenas de la comedia de la Metro, Cuando el diablo asoma, el director W.S. Van Dyke respondió a Breen personalmente con un puñetazo.
Van Dyke was a macho guy himself, former boxer, I guess Breen had also been, and they got into it one night at a bar. Supposedly Van Dyke floored Breen because Van Dyke was tall, wiry, and he had a snoot full of gin.
Pero Breen ganó la batalla. Las escenas de Cuando el diablo asoma se cortaron y se volvieron a rodar.
The double bed was outlawed. There are various stories about whether it was truly the code that made that happen or standards in other countries. But we do know that it's literally true that a man had to keep his feet on the floor while making love to a woman on a divan or a lounge chair.
Well, I think that the denial of reality is what the production code is really all about. When you establish these kinds of moral views, you're not trying to describe the world as it really is. You're trying to describe the world as someone thinks it ought to be.
The Production Code Administration, the Breen office, looked at every single film, all the advertising copy for films, the songs that went into films, and ultimately even the short subjects.
Give me the bird! Give me the bird!
If the Hayes office would only let me, I'd give him to Boyd, all right.
If you saw depicted slum life, it was a cleaner slum after 1934. It sounds silly to say that, but I think it's literally true. The people who stood watch over that code didn't want people going down in the gutter and having their faces shoved in it.
Si los estudios querían reestrenar las películas anteriores al código, solo podían hacerlo con la condición de que cortaran del negativo todas las escenas chocantes.
Well, in King Kong, there's the most famous is where he has Fay Wray and he pulls her clothes off and he smells her, which is pretty overt, and she is pretty naked. The other things that were cut out were shots of Kong when he comes into the native village. He puts this guy in his mouth and it's chewing, and the guy's ah! There's another where he stomps this guy. It's a miracle any of this stuff exists.
Cuando a Jack Warner le denegaron el permiso para reestrenar la atrevida comedia de 1933, Convention City, el estudio tomó la decisión más drástica posible. Destruyeron la película.
When they went looking for Convention City, there was nothing. And I thought, well, wait a minute, we've got to have a print somewhere. There wasn't a print, there wasn't an element, there wasn't anything of Convention City.
A veces, los remakes son totalmente diferentes de los originales precódigo. En 1929, Gene Eagles cometió un asesinato con total impunidad en el film La Carta. Era una película precódigo que se mantuvo fiel a la historia de Somerset Maugham en la que estaba basada.
With all my heart and soul, still love the man I killed.
Pero Bette Davis no tuvo tanta suerte con el remake de 1940. Bajo el ojo vigilante de la oficina de Breen, el personaje tenía que pagar sus pecados con su vida. Sin embargo, algunos críticos vieron la aplicación del código como algo positivo. Argumentaban que sus restricciones obligaban a los cineastas a ser más sutiles y creativos.
These are films which continue to have deep emotional appeal and eroticism. They are far more erotic in their own way because of what they could not show.
The screwball comedy really came of age once the code was imposed, because you couldn't show anything that even smacked of a sexual relationship. So what they did was they sort of vented their sexual frustration through madcap behavior.
Joseph Breen permaneció en su puesto y siguió siendo aceptado por los magnates de Hollywood hasta su jubilación en 1954. Para entonces, el código, que con tanto ahínco había protegido durante 20 años, ya empezaba a derrumbarse.
You begin to see the breakdown of the control of the production code. And part of that was because we were also looking at foreign films, and there was more adult plot lines, some nudity, and Hollywood was beginning to suffer then in the presence of television.
En 1968, el antiguo código fue reemplazado por un sistema de clasificación de la MPAA. Durante algún tiempo, el cine de la época precódigo estuvo olvidado, pero más adelante, la iconoclastia de aquellas películas, su energía y su libertad sexual atraerían a una nueva generación.
I think the fascination with pre-code cinema really began with the advent of home video. We can see these films in their glory, complete, uncut, and see what an extraordinary period in film history this is.
Why aren't you frank enough to admit that other, that indecent self in you? No, you prefer to hide it, pretend it isn't there.
Mitad historia, mitad ficción. El cine precódigo esclarece un capítulo turbulento del siglo XX con sus relatos sensacionalistas de malestar social y liberación sexual.
Are you gonna try and reform me, huh?
What for?
There was a freedom given filmmakers in general during the pre-code era. Like any freedom, it was abused at times. But with good writing, with good acting, with the right director behind that camera, there could be something very special that couldn't be duplicated just a few years later.
To me, they are the early 30s. They spoke a truth of a generation. They spoke a truth of a time in this country.
Well, we strive to please.
You're talking about a time of technological change. You're talking about a time of great social upheaval. And the films reflect all of that. They're great fun. They have a great energy and vitality.
Outside, Countess. As long as they have sidewalks, you've got a job.
Como dijo el director Mervyn LeRoy, fue la época más intrépida de Hollywood y fue emocionante formar parte de ella.
I'll be seeing you.